I thought buying land outside an HOA meant freedom, peace, and a future I could control. Instead, I woke up one December morning to discover my Christmas trees were gone, sold off without my permission, advertised under someone else's authority, and justified by rules that shouldn't have applied to me at all. What started as a quiet pine farm turned into a calculated scam wrapped in fake notices, borrowed power, and one neighbor who believed she was untouchable. I didn't panic. I documented everything. And when the truth surfaced, it didn't just stop the theft, it destroyed the entire scheme. But how did it get this far? Before everything unraveled, life on the pine farm followed a quiet, predictable rhythm. The land sat just beyond the edge of a tightly packed suburban development, where identical roofs lined up like soldiers and manicured lawns were measured down to the inch. My property was different. It was open, uneven, and alive. Rows of pine trees stretched across rolling ground, planted years earlier with patience and intention. Some were still thin and flexible, others tall and full, the kind families stopped their cars for every December. I had bought the land for that exact reason. Not to get rich quickly, not to attract attention, but to build something slow and honest. The farm was meant to be seasonal income and year-round peace. Most days were spent maintaining the trees, repairing fencing, and keeping the property clean enough to avoid problems. The location mattered. The paperwork mattered even more. The land was clearly marked, legally separate, and not governed by the HOA that controlled the nearby neighborhood. That separation felt like a shield at first. The HOA across the road had a reputation for being strict, but it seemed distant, like background noise that didn't apply to me. Their signs stopped at the boundary. Their newsletters stayed in their mailboxes. From my side of the fence, it was just another development with too many rules and too much spare time. The pine farm blended into the community in a way that felt harmless. Families walked by in the fall. Kids pointed out the tallest trees. During winter, cars slowed down, and people took pictures from the road. It felt good knowing the land brought some quiet joy without demanding anything in return. There were no signs, no sales, no staff. Everything was private, controlled, and intentionally low-key. Over time, though, the attention grew. The neighborhood expanded. New houses appeared closer to the property line. The HOA board changed hands, and the tone of the community shifted. What had once been passive oversight turned into active monitoring. People started treating the land like it was part of their shared space, not someone else's livelihood. The boundary felt thinner, even though nothing had changed legally. Small things began to stand out. Flyers appeared on poles near the entrance to the development, advertising seasonal events that referenced the surrounding land. Online posts circulated with photos taken from angles that crossed the property line. The farm was being talked about more often, usually by people who had never stepped foot on it. Still, none of it seemed urgent. There were no direct confrontations, no official notices, no reason to assume anything was wrong. The HOA, from the outside, projected confidence and authority. Their rules were framed as community protection. Their leaders presented themselves as organized and knowledgeable. From a distance, it was easy to believe they stayed within their lane. After all, they had no jurisdiction where the pine trees grew. That assumption became the foundation of a much bigger mistake. As winter approached, the farm required more attention. Tree health mattered. Boundaries mattered. I kept records, photos, and documents organized, the way landowners learn to do when they've seen how quickly misunderstandings can turn into disputes. Nothing about the season felt unusual. The trees were ready, the land was secure, and there were no plans to change how things had always been done. What I didn't know was that someone nearby had already decided otherwise. Somewhere between entitlement and convenience, a narrative was forming that didn't include permission or ownership. The farm was being reframed as a resource rather than private property. The distance between the HOA and my land was shrinking in ways that weren't visible yet. From the outside, everything still looked peaceful. The trees stood tall. The road stayed quiet. The fence remained untouched. But beneath that calm surface, lines were being crossed on paper, online, and in conversations I wasn't part of. By the time the first real sign appeared, the groundwork had already been laid. And the moment the trees disappeared, It became clear this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated decision made by someone who believed authority could be borrowed, rules could be stretched, and ownership could be ignored without consequence. The first real disruption didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived disguised as routine, the kind of bureaucratic overreach that feels irritating but manageable. Notices began appearing on the edge of my property, posted just far enough inside the road-facing boundary to be seen by passing cars. They referenced seasonal safety concerns, traffic flow, and unauthorized commercial activity. None of them were addressed to me directly. None carried my name. They were framed broadly, as if the land itself had violated something by existing too close to the neighborhood. At first, I assumed it was posturing. HOAs thrived on paperwork, and this looked like more of the same. I removed the notices, photographed where they had been placed, and added the images to a growing digital folder labeled with the property address and date stamps. It felt cautious, maybe even unnecessary, but experience had taught me that disputes rarely began at their loudest moment. They crept in through technicalities. Within days, the tone shifted. Online community posts surfaced showing photos of my trees, cropped and framed to suggest accessibility and shared use. The captions implied availability, tradition, and seasonal generosity. None of them mentioned ownership. None asked permission. The comments underneath filled in the blanks, congratulating the HOA for organizing something festive and thanking unnamed volunteers for coordinating access. It felt surreal watching a version of my property circulate publicly as if it belonged to someone else. The next development came through official-looking emails forwarded to me by a sympathetic neighbor. The HOA was distributing announcements about a community tree event, complete with dates, collection times, and safety disclaimers. The language was confident, authoritative, and careful. It never explicitly stated ownership, but it didn't need to. The implication was enough. Anyone reading it would assume the land was under HOA control or, at the very least, available for communal use. I responded the only way that made sense. I documented everything. Screenshots, timestamps, archived links. I reviewed property maps and zoning documents, cross-referencing boundaries with county records. The land was indisputably outside the HOA's jurisdiction. The separation wasn't vague or technical. It was absolute. That certainty became both reassurance and fuel. If this escalated, the facts were on my side. The escalation came faster than expected. Temporary signs appeared overnight along the roadside, directing traffic toward a designated parking area adjacent to my land. The signs bore the HOA logo and language that mirrored their internal communications. They were placed strategically, just outside their development but pointing directly at my property. Removing them felt risky. Leaving them felt worse. I photographed each one before taking them down, noting the tire tracks nearby and the direction they faced. That same week, unfamiliar vehicles began slowing near the entrance. Some stopped. Some turned around. Others parked briefly before moving on. It was subtle, but it was happening. The idea of access was being planted. The farm, once quiet and ignored, was now being framed as an open invitation. Then came the fines. An envelope arrived addressed to property owner. Inside was a notice citing violations related to traffic congestion, unauthorized commercial activity, and failure to maintain community standards. The fine amount was arbitrary but not insignificant. The most alarming part wasn't the demand for payment. It was the assumption of authority. The HOA was acting as though jurisdiction was already established, as though ownership was secondary to their enforcement reach. I didn't pay. I didn't respond emotionally. I added the letter to the file and sent a formal notice disputing the claim, attaching copies of county records and boundary maps. The response was silence. Not acknowledgement. Not correction. Just silence. That silence broke a week later when the activity intensified. Flyers appeared in nearby neighborhoods advertising fresh Christmas trees, locally sourced and community approved. The contact information led to an HOA-managed page. The photos featured my trees. Some were taken from angles only accessible inside the property. That realization landed heavily. Someone had crossed the boundary physically, not just administratively. The sense of violation shifted from abstract to personal. This wasn't paperwork anymore. It was trespass. It was preparation. I installed additional cameras, upgraded locks on the access gate, and notified local authorities of potential unauthorized entry. The response was cautious but supportive. Without an active crime, there was little they could do. But the report created a record. Another layer of documentation. The following morning, tire tracks cut deep into the soil near the tree rows. Fresh, deliberate, and numerous. The gate had been bypassed. Branches were broken. Several trees showed signs of recent cutting, clean and intentional. The absence was unmistakable. Where full pines had stood days earlier, there were now uneven stumps and scattered needles. The shock wasn't loud. It was cold and precise. The realization settled slowly, like a weight pressing inward. This wasn't a misunderstanding or overreach. It was theft carried out under the cover of assumed authority. Within hours, social media posts confirmed it. Smiling families posing with freshly cut trees. Thank you messages praising the HOA for organizing such a wonderful seasonal event. No mention of permission. No acknowledgement of ownership. The comments celebrated efficiency, leadership, and community spirit. I contacted the HOA formally, attaching photographic evidence of the trespass and theft, reiterating the lack of jurisdiction, and demanding immediate cessation of activity. The reply, when it came, was dismissive. It referenced community benefit, implied consent, and leaned heavily on ambiguous language about shared resources and seasonal allowances. There was no apology, no admission, just confidence. That confidence became the most dangerous part. Over the next several days, the activity continued. More trees disappeared. The tracks multiplied. Temporary fencing was moved. New signs appeared, reinforcing the narrative of legitimacy. The HOA doubled down, distributing schedules and updates as if nothing were wrong. The operation was organized, efficient, and entirely unauthorized. Each morning revealed more damage. Each afternoon brought new online praise. The disconnect was maddening. On one side, a property owner watching his livelihood disappear. On the other, a community convinced they were participating in something wholesome and approved. The emotional toll was sharp and constant. Anger threatened to override judgment, but restraint prevailed. Every instinct screamed to intervene directly, to confront the operation head-on. But confrontation without leverage would only escalate things in the wrong direction. The goal wasn't noise. It was resolution. Behind the scenes, I began assembling a comprehensive timeline. Every notice, post, flyer, and fine was logged. Camera footage was cataloged. License plates were recorded. The HOA's own communications became evidence, their confidence turning into liability. Legal counsel reviewed the materials and confirmed what I already knew. The case was strong. The violation was clear. But timing mattered. Acting too early could limit the scope of accountability. Waiting allowed the pattern to establish itself fully. That waiting wasn't passive. It was strategic. As the operation continued, cracks began to form. A neighbor questioned the legality of the event publicly. A local vendor declined involvement after verifying property records. Rumors circulated quietly about ownership disputes. The HOA responded by tightening control, moderating comments, and issuing reassurances. Their tone shifted from celebratory to defensive. Another fine arrived, this one citing obstruction and non-cooperation. It was almost laughable. The audacity underscored how far they believed their authority extended. That belief was about to collide with reality. The turning point came when a regional listing appeared, advertising premium trees sourced from a private reserve. The price point was higher. The audience broader. The scale undeniable. This wasn't just a neighborhood event anymore. It was commercialization built on theft. That listing became the final piece. With everything in place, the strategy moved from observation to action. Authorities were contacted again, this time with evidence that met every threshold. Legal filings were prepared. Media inquiries were initiated discreetly. The narrative that had been built so confidently by the HOA began to unravel under scrutiny. The operation slowed, then stalled. Posts were deleted. Signs disappeared. The silence returned, heavier than before. It wasn't peace. It was anticipation. Because when the truth finally surfaced, it wouldn't just stop the theft. It would expose the entire structure that allowed it to happen. And the people who had hidden behind borrowed authority were about to discover how little protection it offered when the facts spoke for themselves. The moment everything broke open didn't arrive with shouting or spectacle. It arrived quietly, the way consequences often do, when denial finally runs out of room. For weeks, the HOA had operated as if confidence alone could bend reality. Their authority had been asserted through paperwork, branding, and repetition. They spoke in official language, hid behind logos, and relied on the assumption that no one would challenge them hard enough to matter. That assumption was about to collapse. The first crack appeared when a formal cease and desist order landed on the HOA's desk. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was precise, comprehensive, and impossible to dismiss. It outlined trespass, theft, misrepresentation, and unauthorized commercial activity in clear, unemotional terms. Attached were maps, photographs, timestamps, and excerpts from the HOA's own communications. The same emails and posts they had used to legitimize their actions were now evidence against them. What made it devastating wasn't just the content. It was the scope. The document didn't focus on a single incident or misunderstanding. It laid out a pattern, a timeline, a deliberate series of actions taken with full knowledge of the boundary and repeated after being informed of the violation. The illusion of ignorance vanished instantly. The HOA responded the only way organizations do when control slips away. They denied everything publicly while scrambling privately. Internal messages leaked. Posts were quietly edited or removed. Language shifted from confident declarations to vague statements about ongoing review and community concerns. The authority they had projected so carefully began to look thin. Then came the public exposure. Local officials, now fully briefed, conducted an on-site inspection. They didn't arrive in a rush. They didn't need to. The evidence was already complete. They walked the land, documented the damage, and verified the boundaries with county records in hand. There was no debate. No gray area. The trees had been taken. The land had been entered. The HOA had no jurisdiction. The news traveled faster than any announcement the HOA had ever made. Neighbors who had proudly shared photos of their trees began asking questions. Community forums filled with confusion, then anger. The same people who had praised the event now wanted to know how it had been allowed to happen. The narrative flipped almost overnight. The HOA tried to regain control by calling an emergency meeting. Attendance was high. Tension was higher. The leadership presented rehearsed explanations, careful not to admit fault while attempting to frame the situation as a misunderstanding. But the facts refused to cooperate. Printed copies of property maps circulated through the room. Screenshots of deleted posts resurfaced. Dates and times were read aloud. The most damaging moment wasn't an accusation. It was silence. When asked directly how private land outside the HOA had been accessed, marketed, and stripped of inventory without permission, there was no credible answer. Authority without legitimacy collapsed into awkward pauses and deflection. Behind the scenes, the legal pressure intensified. Restitution demands were issued. Liability calculations expanded beyond the value of the trees themselves, factoring in damage to land, loss of future revenue, and misrepresentation. What had been framed as a festive community activity was now clearly a commercial operation built on theft. The HOA's insurance provider entered the picture and immediately distanced itself. Coverage didn't apply to intentional acts outside jurisdiction. That single clarification changed everything. The financial shield the board had assumed would protect them vanished instantly. As accountability narrowed, individual responsibility became unavoidable. The board members who had pushed hardest for the event began distancing themselves from the decision. Statements contradicted earlier messages. Blame shifted internally. The confidence that had fueled the operation turned inward, becoming suspicion and self-preservation. The structure that had seemed unified fractured under pressure. Publicly, the fallout was swift and unforgiving. Local coverage framed the story plainly. A private landowner, a boundary ignored, and an HOA that overstepped so completely it erased its own credibility. The imagery was stark. Rows of stumps where trees had stood. Signs removed. Flyers retracted. Apologies that came too late. What made the climax truly decisive wasn't just the exposure. It was the acknowledgement. The HOA formally conceded fault. Not in broad language. Not buried in disclaimers. In writing. They admitted lack of authority, unauthorized access, and responsibility for damages. The document was signed, filed, and irreversible. The power dynamic shifted instantly. Where there had once been fines and threats, there was now compliance. Where there had been silence and dismissal, there were urgent requests for resolution. The same organization that had acted untouchable was now cautious, restrained, and visibly diminished. Walking the land afterward felt different. The damage was still there. The stumps still marked what had been taken. But the air had changed. The intrusion was over. The scheme was finished. The authority that had justified it was gone. The final blow came quietly but carried lasting weight. The HOA leadership resigned in succession. Not all at once, but inevitably. The community demanded it. Trust had evaporated. The board that had overreached so confidently was dismantled by the consequences of its own actions. What remained was accountability, documented and undeniable. The trees would grow back. The land would recover. But the lesson carved into that neighborhood wouldn't fade so easily. Power borrowed without permission doesn't become real just because it's repeated loudly. And authority assumed without limits eventually collapses under its own arrogance. As the dust settled and the last statements were filed, one truth stood clear above everything else. The scam hadn't ended because it was challenged emotionally. It ended because it was exposed completely. And that exposure was only the beginning of what came next. The weeks that followed felt quieter than expected, but not empty. The silence carried weight. The kind that settles after something irreversible has happened. The Pine Farm no longer felt like a contested space or a misunderstood resource. It felt like what it had always been on paper but never fully respected in practice. Private land, clearly owned, clearly protected. Restitution came first, not as a victory lap but as a formal correction. The HOA was required to compensate for every tree taken, calculated not at casual seasonal prices but at long-term agricultural value. That distinction mattered. It acknowledged that what had been lost wasn't just a holiday decoration, but years of growth, planning, and stewardship. Additional compensation covered soil damage, equipment marks, and the disruption to future harvest cycles. The numbers were substantial enough to be felt, not just absorbed. More important than the money was the precedent. The settlement documents didn't allow for vague interpretations or soft language. Jurisdiction boundaries were reaffirmed explicitly. The HOA was barred from referencing, accessing, or representing the land in any capacity. The agreement was recorded, enforceable, and public. It didn't just end the conflict. It closed the door permanently. The community's response unfolded in stages. Confusion gave way to discomfort, then to reflection. The story forced people to confront how easily authority could be assumed and how quickly convenience could override respect for ownership. Some neighbors reached out quietly, expressing regret for participating without questioning the source. Others stayed silent, unwilling to revisit their role. Both reactions spoke volumes. What changed most noticeably was behavior. Signs didn't reappear. Flyers didn't return. Online posts referencing shared resources vanished entirely. The HOA's communications grew cautious, stripped of overconfidence. Language shifted toward transparency and limitation. They no longer spoke as if proximity equaled control. The boundary, once treated as a suggestion, became visible again. The land itself began to heal. Spring brought new growth where stumps had been. Replacement saplings were planted carefully, protected and documented. The work felt slower than before, but also more intentional. Every step carried a renewed sense of ownership, not just legally but emotionally. The violation had sharpened that connection rather than weakened it. Long-term consequences rippled outward. The HOA rewrote its governance policies under external review. Oversight mechanisms were introduced. Board decisions now required documented jurisdiction checks. Insurance providers imposed stricter conditions. The casual confidence that had enabled the scheme was replaced by procedural restraint. Power, once assumed, now had to be proven. Leadership changes continued beyond the initial resignations. New board members were elected on promises of accountability rather than ambition. Community meetings became less performative and more cautious. Questions were asked where none had been before. Authority no longer went unchallenged simply because it wore a title. From a distance, the outcome might have looked like a clean win. In reality, it was something quieter and more lasting. It was the restoration of boundaries, both physical and ethical. It was a reminder that systems designed to manage communities can just as easily exploit them when unchecked. The experience left behind a sharpened awareness. Documentation wasn't paranoia. It was protection. Silence wasn't peace. It was opportunity for abuse. And confidence, when detached from legitimacy, was a liability disguised as strength. What lingered most wasn't anger, but clarity. The scam didn't succeed because it was clever. It succeeded because people trusted authority without verifying it. It ended not because of outrage, but because facts were allowed to speak without interruption. Standing on the land months later, watching the rows take shape again, the lesson felt grounded and unavoidable. Ownership isn't just a deed. It's vigilance. Boundaries don't enforce themselves. And power, no matter how loudly it's claimed, only exists where it's allowed to go unchallenged. The farm returned to its rhythm. Quiet, steady, honest. But it carried a story now, one rooted as deeply as the trees themselves. A story about how easily lines can be crossed, and how firmly they must sometimes be redrawn. Because in the end, the most dangerous thing in any neighborhood isn't conflict. It's the moment when no one thinks to ask a simple question. Who actually has the right to decide what belongs to whom?